The auction house reeked of desperation. 100 species packed into a cavernous hall, their eyes gleaming with greed, amusement, or sheer indifference as the latest batch of merchandise was dragged onto the stage. Among them stood a man-human, broad-shouldered, scarred from battles both fought and lost. He hadn't planned on being here. He hated places like this. But credits spoke louder than conscience in this part of the galaxy, and he needed payment for a job well done. Final bid for the BlackHFY bondservant. The auctioneer barked. A gaunt, gray-skinned alien trembled at the center of the stage, wrists bound, eyes darting from bitter to bitter, trained, obedient, and fresh off the colonies. Most of the buyers looked bored. The BlackHFY weren't valuable, too weak for labor, too prideful for true servitude. The bids were pathetic. A few hundred credits at most. The human sighed, already regretting his decision to take credits in property instead of hard currency. 200, he muttered, barely paying attention. Sold. The gavel slammed down. The deal was done. The human shook his head as the terrified alien was shoved toward him, shackles clinking. Come on, he grunted, leading them out of the hall. He'd sell them off at the next port or drop them somewhere safe. It wasn't his problem, or so he thought. The moment they stepped into the crowded streets, the BlackHFY looked up at him, voice barely above a whisper. You don't know what you've just done. He frowned. I didn't ask for a lecture. You don't understand, they pressed. I'm not what they think I am. And if they realize who I really am, we are both dead. The human stopped walking. He studied them closer. Their trembling wasn't just fear, it was something more. The way their shoulders curled inward, the way they avoided looking at the patrols scanning the crowd. This wasn't a simple case of some noble brat caught in the wrong place. This was bigger. Start talking, he ordered. The BlackHFY swallowed hard. I am the last heir to the Dominion. He blinked. The Dominion? You mean the empire that fell 20 years ago? Fell, they echoed bitterly. No, it shattered. My family was hunted down. I was smuggled away, hidden, until someone betrayed me. They gestured toward the auction house. That's how I ended up here. A worthless servant. A prize for the lowest bidder. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like a vice. He had just walked out of a public auction with a target on his back. If anyone figured out who this alien really was, there wouldn't be a place in the galaxy safe for either of them. Let's get off-world, he muttered. They barely made it 2 steps before the bounty hunters arrived. A shadow fell across the alley, blocking their escape. 6 figures, armored and armed, weapons half drawn but not quite raised. Professionals. Not thugs. That was worse. Hand over the BlackHFY, their leader said, voice filtered through a modulated helmet. And you get to live. The human exhaled, rolling his shoulders. His fingers twitched toward the concealed blaster at his side. You think I'm just going to hand them over? He asked, stalling for time. You don't know what you're involved in, the bounty hunter warned. That's funny, he said, loosening his stance. I was just about to say the same thing. The tension shattered in an instant. The first shot rang out blinding, searing. The human dove, dragging the BlackHFY with him. A second shot sizzled past his ear. Then everything became a blur of movement, ducking, rolling, returning fire. A body hit the ground. Then another. The smell of scorched metal filled the air. When the dust settled, 3 of them were down, but the rest were regrouping fast. The human grabbed the BlackHFY's wrist and ran. They sprinted through narrow alleys, weaving between stalls, pushing past startled onlookers. He needed a ship. A way off this rock before more of them showed up. You should have let them take me, the BlackHFY gasped as they ran. Not my style, he shot back. They reached the docking bay, alarms blaring in the distance. His ship loomed ahead, a battered but reliable vessel. One more stretch and they'd be free. Then, just as they reached the ramp, the air turned cold. A presence settled over them like a predator's gaze. Going somewhere? A new figure stepped into view. Not armored. Not armed, but far more dangerous. The bounty hunters were muscle. This one? This was something else entirely. The figure blocking their path didn't wear armor, didn't carry a weapon, but the air around them was heavy like the moment before a storm breaks. Their presence alone was enough to make the human hesitate, and that didn't happen often. The HFY air tensed beside him. Their breathing hitched, almost like they recognized this new threat. "You should let the air go," the figure said, voice calm, measured. "You don't understand what you're carrying." The human kept his stance relaxed, but his hand never left his weapon. "You're the second person to say that today," he muttered, "and I'm still not handing them over." The figure sighed, like this was an inconvenience rather than a standoff. "Then you've made your choice." They raised a hand, no weapon, no tech, just a single movement. And suddenly, the human felt like gravity had tripled. His vision blurred at the edges. His knees buckled for half a second before he fought it off, teeth clenched. "Not good." The HFY grabbed his sleeve. "Run." He didn't argue. He moved. They darted up the ship's ramp as the force pressing down on them vanished. A flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, something unnatural, something fast. He shoved the HFY inside just as a shockwave slammed into the hull, rattling the metal like an earthquake had hit. "Strap in," he shouted, sprinting for the controls. The ship's engines roared to life. Warning lights flashed. The dock security systems were already locking onto them, but he didn't care. He punched the thrusters and the ship tore into the sky, leaving behind a trail of fire and chaos. For a few seconds, nothing mattered but the rush of escape, the weightlessness of breaking free from the planet's hold. But it didn't last. The HFY slumped against the co-pilot's seat, shaking. "Who was that?" the human asked, gripping the controls tighter than necessary. The air swallowed hard. "A collector." The name meant nothing to him. "That's supposed to scare me?" The HFY lifted their head. There was something hollow in their expression now, something distant. "It should." The human glanced at the nav screen. Their trajectory was clear for now, but he knew better than to think they were safe. "Start talking," he said. "What's a collector?" The HFY hesitated. "They aren't bounty hunters. They don't work for money. They gather things. People, knowledge, artifacts. They serve something older than any of us." "That's nice and cryptic," the human muttered. The air exhaled shakily. "They don't just take, they erase. When they decide something belongs to them, they make sure it never existed anywhere else. Records disappear. Memories fade. Even the people who knew you forget. They don't just collect, they consume." The humans stared at them. "And you think they want you?" "I know they do." That explained the sinking feeling in his gut. It wasn't just the bounty hunters after them. It wasn't just the remnants of the Dominion trying to wipe out the last heir. It was something worse, something no one survived. "Great," he muttered. "Anything else I should know? Maybe a death cult or a fleet of warships waiting for us at the next jump?" The HFY didn't smile. "It's not a joke." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I got that." The ship's scanners beeped. An incoming signal. No ID, no origin point. Just a pulse, repeating over and over. He frowned. "You expecting a message?" The air shook their head. He hesitated, then pressed the receiver. Static filled the cockpit. Then, words. "You cannot run." The voice wasn't natural. It wasn't mechanical either. It was layered, like a dozen voices speaking at once. The human cut the transmission immediately. "Nope. Not dealing with that." The HFY looked pale. "They already found us." He grit his teeth. They needed a plan. Fast. "The Dominion had allies once," the HFY said suddenly. "Before the war. Before the collapse. And some of them might still exist." The human shook his head. "You want to go knocking on doors that have been shut for 20 years? "It's our best chance," the air insisted. He wasn't sure he believed that, but their options were running out. The nav screen flickered. Something was out there. A presence. A shadow just beyond the sensor's reach. Watching. Waiting. He tightened his grip on the controls. They weren't alone. The human kept his hands steady on the controls, his jaw tight. The ship hummed around them, but that eerie static from the transmission still felt like it lingered in the air. The Ratashi heir sat stiffly beside him, fingers digging into the armrest, staring at the nav screen like they could will away whatever was out there. He checked the scanners again. Nothing. No ships, no signals. But he knew better. Something was watching them. "We need to change course," the heir said, voice thin. He didn't argue. He adjusted the trajectory, taking them off their intended path. A direct route was too dangerous now. Whatever the collector was, whatever force they worked for, it was tracking them. The heir's idea of seeking out Old Dominion allies was risky, but right now, it was the only plan they had. He punched in a new jump calculation. There's a decommissioned trade station 3 sectors from here. No one should be watching it. We stop there, resupply, get information. The heir nodded, but their expression was still grim. Minutes passed. The ship's engines thrummed as the hyperdrive spooled up. The nav computer confirmed the route. Everything was set, but the feeling of unease never faded. Then, just as they were about to jump, the ship's systems flickered. The lights dimmed. The hum of the engine faltered for a split second before roaring back to life. He stiffened. That wasn't normal. The heir's breath hitched. It's them. He checked the scanners again. Still, nothing. But now, deep in the ship's code, a message flashed across the auxiliary screen. "We see you." A chill ran down his spine. He shut off the auxiliary screen and slammed the hyperdrive control. The ship lurched forward, stretching into the jump. Silence fell over the cockpit. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the heir whispered, "They're already inside." He turned to look at them. What? They swallowed hard. The collectors don't need to board a ship. If they decide something belongs to them, they take it. From the inside out. His fingers tightened around the controls. "You saying they're in the system?" The heir shook their head. "Worse. They're in the ship." He didn't like that answer. He didn't like any of this. The moment they dropped out of hyperspace, they needed to check everything's systems, firewalls, security logs. If something had gotten in, they had to flush it out before it could take control. But even as he thought that, a soft sound echoed from deeper in the ship. Not metal creaking. Not the usual noises of the hull settling. Something else. Something moving. He slowly unbuckled his harness. The heir did the same, their eyes locked on the dark hallway leading out of the cockpit. Neither of them spoke. They stepped into the corridor, moving as quietly as possible. The emergency lights cast long shadows against the walls. The ship wasn't that big. If someone was here, it wouldn't take long to find them. Another sound. Closer this time. A whisper of movement just beyond the cargo bay doors. He drew his weapon. The heir pressed a hand against the control panel, hesitated, then hit the override. The doors slid open. The cargo bay was empty. For a long moment, neither of them moved. He scanned the room, keeping his finger on the trigger. The heir stayed just behind him, tense. Then he saw it. A faint shimmer, like heat distortion, hovering near the far wall. His pulse kicked up. That wasn't normal. That wasn't natural. The heir exhaled sharply. It's them. The shimmer flickered, then lunged. He barely had time to react before something cold and formless passed through him. A rush of static filled his skull, like 100 voices whispering at once. For half a second, he wasn't in the cargo bay anymore. He was somewhere else. A void. Endless. Then it was gone. He staggered back, gasping. The heir grabbed his arm, trying to steady him. The shimmer was gone. The cargo bay was silent. But something was wrong. His ears rang. His vision blurred at the edges. A feeling lingered deep in his mind, like something had reached inside him and left a mark. The air looked up at him, their expression unreadable. "You understand now," they whispered. "Don't you?" He swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the weapon. Yeah, he understood. And whatever had just touched him, it wasn't done yet. The silence in the cargo bay felt heavier now, like the air itself had thickened. He tried to steady his breathing, gripping his weapon tighter, but his hands felt cold. The sensation, the thing that had passed through him, hadn't just disappeared. It had left something behind, something he couldn't shake. The air was still staring at him, waiting for a reaction. He didn't have one. Not yet. "We need to leave this ship," they whispered. He shook his head. "Not an option. They'll take it." Their voice was strained. "You don't understand what they are. They don't need airlocks or weapons. They don't need to break in." He scanned the room again. The shimmer was gone, but the feeling wasn't. "Then tell me what they do need." The air hesitated. "A mind." His stomach turned. He wasn't sure what that meant, but it didn't sound good. Before he could press further, the ship shuddered violently. Lights flickered, and a deep groan echoed through the hull, like the entire structure was breathing. Then the emergency alarms blared. His stomach clenched. That wasn't just an ordinary system failure. Something was happening. Something inside. Bridge. Now. They ran. The corridors felt longer than before. The shadows seemed to move at the edges of his vision, but every time he looked, there was nothing there. His own footsteps sounded wrong, like there was an echo just half a second behind them, something out of sync. They reached the bridge, and the control panels were flickering with error messages. The ship was changing. He pulled up the diagnostic screen. Code was shifting in real time, like something was rewriting it, line by line. The nav system was offline. The comms were dead. Life support flickering in and out. The ship wasn't just failing. It was being rewritten. The air backed up, gripping the edge of the console. "It's already happening." He didn't look at them. He was too focused on what was in front of him. Then, slowly, he realized something. The controls weren't just failing. They were responding. To him, the code wasn't random. It was reacting. The ship wasn't breaking down. It was listening. A cold knot formed in his gut. This wasn't an attack. This wasn't an invasion. It was a takeover, and he was at the center of it. His fingers hovered over the console, but he didn't touch it. He didn't have to. The screens flickered, and a single message scrawled across the main display. "You belong to us now." His breath caught in his throat. The air reached for his arm, gripping it tightly. "We have to get out." He wanted to move. He really did. But something was keeping him frozen in place. Because, deep down, he knew. He could still feel it, the whispering static in the back of his mind. Something had already gotten in, and it wasn't leaving. The whisper in the back of his mind grew louder. It wasn't a sound, not really. It was more like a presence, something unseen pressing against his thoughts, testing them, pushing at the edges of his will. His fingers twitched above the console, and the screens flickered again. The message was gone. The system was waiting, watching. The air's grip on his arm tightened. "We don't have time," they said, their voice lower now, almost urgent. "If it's inside, we have to act before it takes control." He wanted to move, to step back from the console, but his legs felt weighted. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something pulling at him. Then the lights cut out. Total darkness. For half a second, everything was silent. No alarms. No flickering screens. Just the sound of his own heartbeat hammering in his chest. Then a voice, not the air's. Not his own. "You should have left." The emergency lights kicked on, casting the bridge in a cold red glow. His pulse pounded as he turned, searching for the source. But there was no one else in the room. The air took a sharp step back. That's not the ship. He didn't need them to tell him that. He could feel it, pressing against him now, inside him. The whisper wasn't just in his head anymore. It was in the ship, in the air. He forced himself to breathe, to think. If it's talking, it means it's aware. The air shook their head. It was always aware. You just didn't notice. He didn't like that answer. The screens blinked back to life, but the text on them was shifting too fast to read. Not a system reboot. Not a malfunction. A rewrite. The ship wasn't being hijacked. It was being transformed. And then, the starboard hull groaned. Metal twisted, screeched. The sound of something moving, not outside, inside the walls. He grabbed the heir's wrist and pulled them toward the door. "We're leaving." Now. The corridor was worse than before. The walls seemed narrower, like they were closing in. The red emergency lights pulsed, casting long shadows that didn't match their movements. And the air thicker now, like they were breathing something that wasn't just oxygen. The whisper was stronger. And then, a shape at the end of the hall. Not human. Not anything he recognized. It stood in the flickering red light, its form shifting, unstable, like it hadn't decided what shape to take yet. But its eyes, or what passed for them, were locked on him. Not the air. Him. He stopped cold. The whisper wasn't just a presence anymore. It was calling his name. The thing at the end of the corridor moved. Not with a step. Not like a creature, more like a shadow breaking apart and reforming, shifting in and out of existence between the flickering red lights. The whisper inside his skull turned into a steady pulse, pressing against his thoughts, pushing him forward. It wanted something. The air yanked at his arm. "Don't let it in." His muscles locked. The whisper wasn't just calling his name anymore. It was speaking in his voice. "You've already listened," it said. His own voice, but stretched, twisted, spoken in a way he had never spoken before. He clenched his jaw, pushing back against it, forcing himself to move. One step. Then another. The air pulled harder, dragging him down the hall. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the ship itself was breathing, and with every second, the presence inside his head grew stronger. They reached the emergency hatch, and he slammed his hand against the override panel. Nothing. The screen flickered, the whisper spilling into the ship's systems now, twisting the controls against him. "This body is not yours." The words made his skin crawl. He turned to the air. "What does it want?" Their expression was grim. "A vessel." His stomach dropped. The ship let out a deep, shuddering groan. The floor beneath them vibrated. And then it spoke again. Not in his voice this time. In the air's. "You should not exist." The air's face paled. For the first time, he saw something in them that hadn't been there before. Fear. A blast of energy surged through the walls. The emergency lights blew out. Darkness swallowed them whole. And in that instant, he felt something inside him rip free. Not physically. Not something he could fight. Something leaving. Or something taking over. The whisper was no longer at the edge of his thoughts. It was inside. And as his vision blurred, as the ship's shape twisted around him, he realized he wasn't the one moving anymore. He gasped as if breaking the surface of deep water, but the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, charged with something unnatural. His limbs felt distant, like they weren't his anymore. His vision swam, shapes twisting at the edges. The whisper wasn't whispering anymore. It was speaking through him. The air was staring at him, their fists clenched. "Fight it," they ordered, voice sharp, but he could hear the unsteadiness beneath it. His mouth opened on its own. His voice came out, but the words weren't his. "There is no fight. He is already gone." He tried to move, to push back against the thing inside him, but it was like wrestling with a current pulling him under. His own body wasn't listening. The thing that had been whispering, lurking in the dark, had taken hold. But then the air stepped closer. Their expression changed, not just determination, but something else. Understanding. "No," they said softly. "You're still in there." His fingers twitched. A flicker of resistance. A crack in the thing's control. The air pressed a palm to his chest, right over his heart. You don't belong to it. Their voice was steady now. Certain. You never did. And for the first time, the thing hesitated. A sharp, splitting pain cracked through his skull as he felt it, not just its presence, but its weakness. It had used his body, but it had never fully taken him. Not yet. And now it was struggling. He clenched his fists, forcing every ounce of willpower into a single thought: get out. The whisper turned to a shriek, its control slipping. His muscles burned as he shoved it out, breaking free inch by inch. The thing screamed, its voice warping, twisting, until suddenly, silence. His knees buckled. The air caught him before he hit the ground. He sucked in a ragged breath, feeling his body again, truly his own. The ship around them had gone still. No more shadows moving in the dark. No more whispers clawing at his mind. The air let out a slow breath. It's over. He didn't trust himself to speak yet, just nodded. His hands still shook. They stayed like that for a long moment before the air helped him to his feet. We need to leave. He glanced around, half expecting the walls to shift, the lights to flicker again. But the ship remained quiet. Whatever had been here, whatever had tried to claim him, it was gone. Or at least, it had lost. As they made their way to the nearest escape pod, he cast one last look down the corridor. The darkness no longer felt alive. The air no longer hummed with something unnatural. But a part of him knew. Somewhere out there, it was still waiting. And next time, it might not lose.